Good evening. Welcome to the new People's University, the struggle for women's rights. This past Tuesday was the 100th, the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment. So that's what we'll be talking about tonight, going back in time and coming forward to that event. And in the future weeks, in the 6-week series we're doing, we will cover other topics, including the Equal Rights Amendment, the Me Too movement, powerful women in history, and the Wheeling suffrage movement. So stay with us. Here's our little logo. So this is a 6-week series. It runs through September 27th, as you can see, every Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Tuesday, Fair May will be here at Lunch with Books to do colonial music for you. And next Thursday, Joyce Salisbury will be the instructor for the People's University, and she will talk about the powerful women of history. Now, I want to remind you that this evening that you can, let me hold it up for you because it's here, win this fabulous puzzle, if I get it the right way. Votes for Women puzzle, 500-piece jigsaw. All you have to do is ask a relevant question at the end, and we'll get you in the drawing, which will be announced on our Facebook page sometime later this evening after the program. And it will go out to you via the U.S. mail, just so you know. Our guest tonight is Dr. Marie Lofaso. She has been with us a few times before, both at People's University and at our Ruther Pollock Labor History Symposium over at Walls Foundation. She is the Arthur V. Hodges Professor of Law at West Virginia University College of Law. And in 2010, she was named WVU College of Law Professor of the Year. She is a 4-time recipient of the WVU College of Law Faculty Scholarship Award. Here is Anne-Marie Lofaso.
Thank you so much, Sean. I really love speaking at these events. They're really a highlight of my year, and I get to do 2 of them in the next month. So I'm very excited. And it's truly an honor to be able to speak about the struggle for women's rights, and in particular, the history leading up to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Obviously, as a woman, this is very important to me, but also as the mother of a daughter and the sister of other siblings, sisters, it's very important to me, and also to see it's important for my female students. So one thing I was telling Sean before we began is how much history repeats itself. So I'm going to do that theme today. I think most of you will know the dates of things, and we obviously are going to go over some stuff like that. But what I really want to do is tell some stories, and so that you really get a feel for why this was a struggle and how it looks almost surreal and almost silly now with modern eyes. But the time, looking at the time of those people's existence 100 and more years ago, people really felt in a certain way. And maybe this will give us some empathy for how people feel today that may look silly in 100 years. So we're going to talk about first the socioeconomic pressures that really pushed toward the women feeling that they earned the right to vote. But to do that, we need to go a little bit back in time and look at this ideal of what's called the cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood. And this is not a cult in the religious sense. This was really a group of ideas that people developed in the 19th century in response to industrialization. So what we saw in the 19th century were basically that men and women were increasingly no longer working side by side on the farm together. And of course, for a long time, for many hundreds of years, you did have most men and women working on a farm, and they would work side by side. And men might do certain chores and women might do other chores on that farm, but they were working together in this family farm, or in, if you go back, feudal times, it wasn't a family farm, but they had this in this agrarian type society, you had a certain way of life. But increasingly, with the beginnings of industrialization in the early 19th century and then real increased industrialization later on, you see men leaving rural life and going more into urban life, or going out of the farm and going into factories to work and building canals, building railroads, building bridges, building up the infrastructure of our new nation. At the same time, women's traditional work was increasingly manufactured in those factories, and those goods were purchased in stores. So you might have women would traditionally have sewn clothes, have maybe made shoes, would have preserved foods like jams and things like that. And what you're seeing is a lot of that work is being done in more specialized ways, and that people were buying them. So the question then became, for this working class and middle class society, was, what is the proper role for women in this new society? And the answer was the cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood. And this I found on the internet. There's lots of pictures from the 19th century. This is a daguerreotype. I've seen some of the very first ones when I went to England, and I lived in England for a while, and it's really amazing, these early photographs. But this is circa 1850, and these are the Clark sisters. You probably know, why do they always look so stern in these pictures? And it's because the flash would take a long time to go off, so they had to sit really still, so they were told to sit like this. So they always look really stern. But I wanted you to just look at what people wore around the time of Seneca Falls, which is, this picture is about from 1850, probably a little before, so right about that time of how women were dressing. Now, the cult of domesticity, or true womanhood, there were 5 characteristics. Now, in the very first article that wrote about this, I think was in the 1960s, that really captured this and really did a lot of research realizing this is what was going on. The first characteristic, white, was left out, but it was implicit. So I'm explicitly putting it in, because to be a true woman was to be white. Being a Black woman was not an ideal. Obviously, this was during slavery. There's the tragedy of slavery and the whole tragic story of race, which we're going to touch a little bit upon today, but I'm going to focus mostly on womanhood, and we're going to talk about womanhood mostly in terms of whiteness, although we will do a little bit about race. The others are piety, purity, submission, and domesticity. So I want to go through some of those. This is Dr. Charles Miggs was an obstetrician. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania College of Medicine in 1817, and he famously, in speaking to a graduating class where he taught medical school at Jefferson Medical School in Philadelphia, he explained to the medical students why women were naturally religious. Hers is a pious mind. Her confiding nature leads her more readily than men to accept the proffered grace of the gospel. So this is a man who has dedicated his medical career to helping women give birth, to helping women in something that's purely female, right, giving birth. And his understanding of women is completely wrong, actually, because there's no evidence that women are genetically, although they didn't understand what genes are, more pious, or whatever that means, than men. But here he is, and he's stating this to his graduating class, which I'm sure was of all men. Now, the next one was purity, and this is the idea of chastity before marriage. Although very significantly, the idea was also that there was also some idea of chastity even within marriage, where sex was not to be enjoyed, but was a chore that a woman gave of herself to her husband so that she could have children. So the idea of purity, which here is symbolized by the white lilies, and I'm going to talk about why I'm doing that in a second. But this comes from an article that's in part of the bibliography at the end of this lecture, but I wanted to read some of this. Purity was as essential as piety to a young woman, its absence as unnatural and unfeminine. Without it, she was in fact no woman at all, but a member of some lower order. A fallen woman was a fallen angel, unworthy of the celestial company of her sex. To contemplate such loss of purity brought tears. To be guilty of such a crime in the woman's magazines, I'll explain that in a second, at least, brought madness or death. Even the language of flowers had bitter words for her. A dried white rose symbolized death preferable to the loss of innocence. The marriage night was the single great event of a woman's life, when she bestowed her greatest treasure upon her husband, and from that time on was completely dependent upon him, an empty vessel without legal or emotional existence of her own. So just a couple of things. First, what are they talking about with these women's magazines? Well, the woman who first came up with this idea and cataloged this, and it's since many other scholars have cataloged these adjectives for what the womanhood was all about, first looked at hundreds of magazines from that time period and found these were the things being said. So that's what, originally the scholarship was limited to magazines, but it's since been in books, in literature, in all different things has these studies been done. So here you can see that a woman, rather than giving up her purity, it would be better to be dead. And that would be symbolized by a dried white lily. Now, the third adjective or characteristic of womanhood is the most feminine virtue, is considered the most feminine virtue, which is submission. So the idea here was that, yes, all people were supposed to be religious, but men didn't have time for that. And men were also supposed to be pure, but the problem was it just came too hard for them. Men were the movers, the doers, and the actors, and women were passive, submissive responders. And that this order was literally fixed in heaven, that man was woman's superior by God's appointment, if not intellectual dowry. Charles Eliot wrote that women should submit to man for the sake of good order, at least. And he wrote that in the Ladies Repository, a magazine from the mid-19th century. Here's another journal, The Ladies' Companion, which praised a young woman, a wife, because she said that she did not think women should feel and act for herself, because when next to God, her husband is not the tribunal to her heart and intellect appeals, the golden bowl of affection is broken. Women were warned that if they tampered with this quality, they tampered with the order of the universe. So here was some more advice given by Caroline Gilman she was giving advice to a bride. And she said that you have to establish this proper order from the very beginning of marriage. And she writes, "Oh, young and lovely bride, watch well the first moments when your will conflicts with his, to whom God and society have given the control. Reverence his wishes, even when you do not his opinions." In Recollections of a Southern Matron, the perfect wife realizes that the three golden threads with which domestic happiness is woven are: repress a harsh answer, confess a fault, and stop, right or wrong, in the middle of self-defense in gentle submission. And I found this picture of a bride from the mid-19th century, and I imagine, given the look on her face, that she's being told this advice, and clearly she's not going to obey it. I don't know what's going to happen to her, but anyway. So they would encourage women that they could do this. They know it was going to be hard, but they could do it because in her heart, she knew she was right and she could afford to be forgiving. So women might be right about something, but they can afford to be forgiving, even a trifling condescending. If their husband is a little condescending, they can still be okay. So men are not unreasonable, Their difficulties lie in not understanding the moral and physical nature of our sex. They often wound through ignorance and are surprised at having offended. Wives were advised to do their best to reform men, but if they couldn't, just to give up gracefully. And if any habit of his annoyed me, I spoke of it once or twice calmly, then bore it quiet. So again, this idea that women would suppress any anger, and remember, when one is angry, it's because they feel that an injustice has been committed upon them. Anger and justice go hand in hand often. And so what women were to do is just repress that, because the proper order of the universe is that the man is in control and the woman is submissive, just as in the master-servant relationship, it was the husband-wife relationship and the parent-child relationship. And this leads us to our next characteristic, which is domesticity. And a woman's place was in the home. A woman's place was near her fireplace. As society is constituted, the true dignity and beauty of the female character seem to consist in a right understanding and faithful and cheerful performance of social and family duties. So this is Mrs. Farley on her essay, Domestic and Social Claims on Women. And Mrs. Stanford, citing scripture, says, St. Paul knew what was best for women when he advised them to be domestic. There is composure at home. There is something sedative in the duties which home involves. It affords security, not only from the world, but from delusions and errors of every kind. And the warning was that women who did not live up to these four virtues were a threat to society and the United States as we know it. So I just want to stop here for a second and think about what, in doing research for this lecture, of course, I was familiar with the cult of domesticity, as any law professor that teaches feminism would be. But what I really didn't appreciate was how history really repeats itself. Because one of the things we're hearing right now is things like there's disorder in the streets. We need to stop rioting. Now, personally, I'm a woman of peace. I don't like rioting at all. But I also don't believe that the earth is going to stop moving because people are complaining because they don't feel they have their rights. So this is something I think we have to think about. We're going to see this. Women are going to start to protest, and you know what's going to happen to them? They're put in jail. They're beaten. They're told they want to make them submit to see that they're wrong. So we're seeing some of that even going on today, which ironically gave me a lot of hope that things were going to be okay, and that somehow history writes things and we as Americans will come up with the right solution. But that's sort of my optimistic view of things, and I hope I'm right, that everything will be okay. But I did want to say that it did seem like an Armageddon when you read some of this thing, that if women were to do these things, things would be very bad. This is a case from 1872. It's called Bradwell versus the state. I teach this case. I love to teach this case because it's about a lawyer. And Mrs. Bradwell wants to become a lawyer. She wants to practice law, and she meets all of the requirements to practice law, except for one. She's a woman. And so Illinois denies her the right to practice law, and the Supreme Court holds that that's not unconstitutional. And it is quoted as saying, man is, or should be, woman's protector and defender. The natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. The constitution of the family organization, which is founded in the divine ordinance, as well as in the nature of things, indicates the domestic sphere as that which properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. So you can see right here in the Supreme Court text from 1872 that these justices have, either through osmosis or they've been somehow imbibed these ideas that are in the air, that are in women's magazines, that are being preached in churches all around the country, that are really all over the place, about this divide between man and woman. Here's a little bit more I thought it's worth reading. The harmony, not to say identity of interest and views which belong or should belong to the family institution, is repugnant to the idea of a woman adopting a distinct and independent career from that of her husband. So firmly fixed was this sentiment in the founders of the common law that it became a maxim of that system of jurisprudence that a woman had no legal existence separate from her husband, who was regarded as her head and represented in the social state, and notwithstanding some recent modifications of the civil status, many of the special rules of law flowing from and dependent upon this cardinal principle still exist in full force in most states. Before I go on, let me explain some of that. The common law is just the law made by judges, which of course were all white men, property owners, so they were wealthy white men, so they would certainly not be rural white men or working class white men. They'd have to be relatively wealthy white men, and certainly with no representation from women, from mostly none from most ethnic groups, at least not until the 19th century, till the 20th century rather. And so mostly from very, very early immigrants of English descent, maybe German, maybe something else. Okay, but you're not going to see any kind of real diversity in that. And this idea was that these men said that when a woman marries a man, she loses her complete legal existence, which is why I have the invisible woman as an image here. And instead, she becomes Mrs. John Smith. She no longer exists. She is him, and he makes all the decisions for her. She cannot own property. She cannot engage in contracts, enter contracts. And that's why many of the early suffragists actually chose not to marry. They chose that they wanted to be independent because the law did this to them. Now, this is what's interesting. So the law created this. And then they say, here, let's go on to what this is. Okay, so remember, they're saying that the woman does no longer exist. And one of these is that a married woman is incapable without her husband's consent of making contracts, which shall be binding on her or him. So a woman can't make those because that's what the law says. And remember, the law is written by these men. This very incapacity was one circumstance which the Supreme Court of Illinois deemed important in rendering a married woman incompetent fully to perform the duties and trusts that belong to the office of an attorney and counselor. So because men had decided that women cannot have full citizenship, they're invisible legally, they can't become part of that legal system that could actually change things. This is called structural sexism. You would have to rely on a group of men to do something that wouldn't necessarily be in their interest. We call those allies today, to change things then, rather than it being changed because there's actually some self-interested person. Instead, as we know, the law is made up. When we go into politics and we go into the legislature, we vote based on our interests. Now, sometimes we get our interests wrong, fine, but we vote for the person we believe is going to represent our interests. Well, if we have no representation, we can't change. And this is the structural nature of these problems. So going back to this public-private sphere, the public sphere was politics, business, it was violent, it was not for women. Women was family, safety, it was virtuous. Women's job was to impart religion to the children, also to make their men better men, because remember, men don't have time for religion. They didn't have time to be pious. They were out doing what they're doing. They're smoking cigars and they're conducting business and they're doing whatever they need to do. And so you have this problem. And so we need to have this idea of what women's role is now. And this is it. Now, remember, I think this is important, how much of this is really going on in a non-urban area? How much of this is in a rural area? where there might have been more equality. Okay, well, we won't be able to answer that question today, but I think I've uncovered a few things that give us some tips on how maybe we viewed some of that. So interestingly, social reform is viewed as an attack on the cult of true womanhood now. So we have this really interesting made up dialogue between a young lady and a professor. And yes, some women were allowed to go to college to get some education in literature and things like that. So the young lady is expressing admiration for bloomers. And I'm going to show you what bloomers are in a little bit, because it gives freedom of motion, is healthful and attractive. So bloomers are basically, and I'll show you, their pants, okay? And the professor setting her straight says trousers are only one of the many manifestations of that wild spirit of socialism and agrarian radicalism, which is at present so rife on our land. And the lady says, if this dress has any connection with Fourierism or socialism or fanaticism in any shape whatsoever, I have no disposition to wear it at all. No true woman would so far compromise her delicacy as to espouse, however unwillingly, such a cause. So this was this dialogue was in the Ladies Wreath, and it was a made-up dialogue between this young lady and her professor about the dangers of wearing bloomers. Fourierism is named for Charles Fourier, was an early socialist. So it was somehow wearing trousers was seen as you were a socialist. Socialism is radical, radicalism is bad, and therefore we can't allow women to even step into trousers. So this is a really funny story that I wanted to tell you that is actually a pretty famous story. I found it, it's turned up in like so many of the sources I've been looking at over and over again, so I thought it would be fun to share with you, although I had never heard of it before recently. So this is a Long Island Railroad station in College Point. It's called Long Island. It's actually in Queens, New York, but back then, I'm from New York, so this is just something that I know. Long Island is this island south of Manhattan Island, which is also an island, and the eastern part of that is Brooklyn and Queens, which are counties or boroughs, as they're called in New York, of New York City, and the rest of Long Island, eastern Long Island, is what we call Long Island proper today. Okay, more than you need to know about that. But this is when Queens, which is part of New York City back then and still is, was much more suburban and even rural. So you can see this is this railroad station that the Long Island Railroad Station goes out from Long Island into Manhattan, and that's to get people in and out of the city proper, Manhattan being the city proper. So there were these school teachers in College Point that wanted to ride their bicycles from their homes in the outskirts of Flushing to the inner part of Flushing called College Point, at this college where they were teaching. And William Sutton was very upset because they were riding bicycles. So listen to what he says, and this is going to be connected to bloomers. We as trustees are responsible to the public for the conduct of the school and are in great measure guardians of the morals of the pupils. In the first place, I do not consider it to be the proper thing for any young lady to ride a bicycle, and in the person of a school teacher, it is particularly out of place. As far as the question of riding before or after school hours and when away from the school is concerned, we have no authority, but we will not permit them to ride bicycles to or from the schoolroom. That's 1895. So it is not the proper thing for ladies to ride the bicycle. They wear skirts, of course, but if we do not stop them now, they will want to be in style with the New York women and wear bloomers. Then how would our schoolrooms look with the lady teachers parading around amongst the boys and girls wearing bloomers? They might just as well wear men's trousers. I suppose it will come to that, but we are determined to stop our teachers in time before they go that far. So the response, and this is one teacher's response, and I cannot find her name, so her name is lost to history, unfortunately. But she says, I think it is a shame that such an action should be taken by the trustees. I do not consider that riding a bicycle has a tendency to create immorality. I consider the resolution an outrage and an insult. Well, she was speaking her mind and was clearly not a part of the cult of womanhood. She was not a perfect woman, was she? The superintendent, a woman named Mary Lyle, actually praised the women teachers, said that they were not causing any harm by bicycling. She praised their moral character, but she enforced the ban as she felt she had to. The whole story is found in Ms. Magazine. They're doing something today in feminist history. This was published a few months ago in June, and I gave you the citation to that. So this is what bloomers might look like, and there's a dialogue from another journal from 1895 that I found online, and Gertrude is talking to her friend Jessie, and she says, "My dear Jessie, what on earth do you have that bicycle suit for?" So interestingly, these bloomers are also called bicycle suits when you have the whole thing on like that. And Jessie says, "Why, to wear, of course." And Gertrude says, "But you haven't got a bicycle." And Jessie says, "No, but I've got a sewing machine." And I just love it. It's funny. But it's also funny because, of course, she would be making her own clothing, right? So that also I just found really funny that she would be. Anyway, I think you guys understand why I find it funny. I hope you do too. And it also just shows, looking at it in our 21st century eyes, how in some ways ridiculous this is. However, I think that reminds me sometimes that we are very judgmental of people in history. And yes, sometimes we should be judgmental. Slavery was horrible. But other things, I think maybe we go too far. And I sometimes think we have to try to get into that mindset and understand that there are a lot of pressures that shape who we are. And all we can do is try to be open-minded and read and listen and talk to people and try to understand how people feel about things. So that's the whole one. Oops. All right. This is our timeline now. I'm going to go into just talking to you about how we got women's suffrage with the rest of my time. And then I'm going to take questions. So this should take about 20 minutes or so to do this. So now that you sort of understand what life is like in the mid-19th century, you can understand that here, if you are an educated woman, or even not an educated woman, okay, but you might be a woman who is on a farm, not able to get through all of school, but you have a mind of your own, and you might actually feel that this doesn't seem right to you. But here you have Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they decide they're going to go off to London because, of course, a lot of women at that time were abolitionists, and they want to go to this convention, but they're barred from attending it because they're women. So they're angry. So they decide then and there that they really need to do something about this. So this all leads up to the first Women's Rights Convention that's held in Seneca Falls in New York, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton writing the Declaration of Sentiments, creating this agenda for women's activism that is set for decades. And this is really important. This is before the Civil War. And there is only one man who's invited, and there's one Black person, and that's Frederick Douglass. So it is very much a white woman's issue here, even though it really is a woman's issue. So that, I think, is important. There is some intersectionality here because these white women were concerned about slavery, but there's also friction, and we're going to see this friction play out a little bit with race, and also a little bit on I don't want to call it radical. I'm going to call it a more left-wing approach and a more moderate approach to how to get their goals. And it's the same thing, once again, that's happening today. And it's playing out predominantly with race, although to some extent also with gender. 1849, California becomes the first state to extend property rights to women in their state constitution. I'm not going to go through all. Last year I did that, and I went through a bunch of laws. I'm just going to do some highlights, specifically focusing more on the women's right to vote. And then we have the first and the second, in the 50s, the first and the second women's rights conventions, one in Worcester, Massachusetts. Well, actually, both in Worcester, Massachusetts. And Worcester is is outside of Boston. Anyway, Frederick Douglass attends. Lots of these famous people, you know William Lloyd Garrison, you probably know Lucy Stone, you know Sojourner Truth. You know a lot of these people. And there's a strong alliance formed with the abolitionist movement here. And then again, and Horace Mann attends the next one. Other people, you've probably heard of Elizabeth Oakes Smith, Harry Ward Beecher, who's a very popular reverend at the time. And the Women's Rights Convention, there's a Women's Rights Convention also in Akron, Ohio, where Sojourner Truth delivers her Ain't I a Woman speech. Now, I have it recorded, but I'm afraid I may not play it for you because I'm afraid that we might, let's see, maybe at the end we'll try to play it because it's really well done. And, I can't remember the name of the actress that does it, but she's famous for, she was in Scandal. So it will come to me, but she does a really good job. It's very, very moving to listen to that speech. One of the lines in it actually is something like, well, you say that women can't do certain things because Jesus was a man. And then she says, well, where did your Jesus come from? Where did your Jesus come from? He came from a woman and God. Man had nothing to do with it. And it's just you could see this woman. And by the way, I looked up more about her. Of course, everyone knows who Sojourner Truth is. But, when I start doing things, I look them up. I want to know more about them. Do you know that she was 6 feet tall? So can you imagine this presence of this woman, this former slave who fled slavery with her child? I mean, how brave she must have been. And then she gives a speech, and she's a towering 6 foot tall woman. I mean, she must have been amazing. It must have been amazing to watch that speech if you had the honor of being there, the privilege of being there. In any event, we're seeing that other major issues for these suffragists are property, women's property rights. We have the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. We have women. We have some women delegates, such as Susan B. Anthony and Antoinette Brown, who are not allowed to speak at the World Temperance Convention, which is held in New York City. We're going to talk about temperance in a second. This is the Ain't I a Woman speech. I was going to put it here, but I'm afraid if I click on it, we're going to crash the system. So why don't we wait on that, and we'll see if we can do that later. Then the story goes that during the Civil War, suffragists went to help the war movement, and right after that's done, they get busy again with the right to vote. And this is where things get, I think, very interesting from a political standpoint, because there's two strategies. And one strategy is we go for everything, the women's right to vote and the right to vote regardless of race. And the other strategy is let's get the vote for people of color, or men of color, black men, former slaves, and we'll worry about women later. So one is a more radical approach and one is a more conservative approach. Now, it reminds me of the exact debate that the LGBTQ community and allies were having over, do you go for LGBT rights or LGB rights, or do you go for everything, LGBTQ? So do you go for also transgender rights with gay rights, or do you just go for gay rights? And that gets played out. And also the other strategy that gets played out more recently is, do you go for a federal solution or a state-by-state solution? And what we see is originally the gay rights movement goes for a state-by-state solution, and it's mostly gay rights. And then it starts to come together with a gay and transgender agenda. And once there's a lot of states that decide to give gay rights and transgender rights, they go for the federal solution. Here we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony again, and they formed the American Equal Rights Association. They're dedicated to the goal of suffrage for all, regardless of gender or race. So that's considered the radical solution. So that would be the far left-wing solution. That's why I always love these terms. You know, when my students say, well, is that left-wing or right-wing? I'm like, I don't know what those terms mean, because today's left-wing is tomorrow's right-wing. So I just like to say that in its time, this was a radical solution. This was seen as more left-wing, you know, because these terms just keep on changing depending on when you are. Now, there's also the first publication of the Revolution, which is like a journal. It's actually a periodical, and it has the motto: "Men, their rights and nothing more; women, their rights and nothing less." The senator from Kansas introduces a federal women's suffrage amendment to Congress. That's 1868. And the 14th Amendment is ratified, but citizens and voters are defined exclusively as male. The 15th Amendment is going to come along, and the 15th Amendment, as you know, is that's the following year, is only for Black males. It avoids the question of women's suffrage entirely. And this creates this really cleaves in half the American Equal Rights Association, which really feels that, I think a lot of the women feel somewhat betrayed by this. In the same year, Wyoming becomes the first territory that's organized with a woman's suffrage provision. Now, I find this really fascinating, that it must have been very rural, and there's probably a strong libertarian streak. And this is what I mean by it. I think that's at least some clue that maybe a lot of this anti-women's vote is coming from urban areas. But again, I haven't really done enough research to say that I feel confident in my conclusion. I think that's a hypothesis at this point, and that to me suggests that that could be right, but we have to do a lot more. So I wanted to point that out, see what you guys think about that. Stanton and Anthony decide that they're going to found the National Women's Suffrage Association with headquarters in New York, and that's going to be the so-called more radical institution to achieve the vote through constitutional amendment and push for other women's rights, so that they want to federalize that right. And Lucy Stone and others are going to form the American Women's Suffrage Association headquartered in Boston, and they're going to try to go through amending individual state constitutions. So their strategy is going to be a state one and a more conservative one. So again, this is sort of these two strategies are going together, and it's sort of the same thing that happened, I think, with gay rights. Sorry, now you have the 15th Amendment that's actually passed and ratified is 1870. And the National Women's Suffrage Association refuses to work on its ratification, and instead the members advocate for a 16th Amendment universal suffrage, which we know the 16th Amendment is not universal suffrage, it's the federal tax, income tax, but they're just a few numbers off. It will be the 19th. Frederick Douglass then breaks with Stanton and Anthony over their position. So he gets really annoyed about this. The Women's Journal is then founded by the more conservative faction. And in the meantime, you have this backlash, just like we have today, and the anti-suffrage party is founded. Now we're into the 1880s, and Susan B. Anthony tries to vote for Ulysses Grant. In the presidential election, she's arrested. She's brought to trial. 15 other women are arrested for illegally voting. And Sojourner Truth appears in a polling booth, but she's just turned away. So women are being turned away from the right to vote. Now, this is interesting. In the 1870s, what happens is you have the women are now joining the Temperance, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So why they founded this woman, Annie Wittenmeyer, and Frances Willard becomes the head for a long time. And they become important in the fight for women's suffrage. So why is temperance and women's suffrage, why are they put together? Why is it seen as a woman's issue? Because there was an observation that when men went out and they drank, they came home and they beat their wives. Now, does that mean that every man that went out and drank came home and beat their wives? No. But there was a correlation between this. And so some women felt at least, that if they could stop drinking, they could stop the sale of liquor, that they would be able to have a safer home for themselves and for their children. And so it is this belief that pushes the women's Christian temperance movement and the suffragists together, and they make a very powerful enemy, the liquor lobby. So in the meantime, the more radical suffragists are kind of pushed out, as seen as too radical. And finally, though, in the late 1800s, a woman's suffrage amendment is proposed in Congress, and it is identical in wording to the one that would pass 41 years later. What's interesting is in that time, I think it's 26 countries give women the right to vote before the United States ever does, as a country, as a whole nation. So we are not anywhere near the top of that. The first vote on women's suffrage is defeated, and this is the late 1880s. But there's a National Council of Women that's established to promote the advancement of women. And now you have the events leading, actually, I think I have these out of order. Sorry, I put them out of order by accident. Let's start with the early 1900s. What we have here is we have what I like to call the intersectionality of the progressive movements. You've got you've got unions involved. You've got the state working. So now you're going to start to see. So Washington adopts women's suffrage. Unions are pushing for it. But you're getting opposition also, Greg. So you're getting this polarization of society. Those in opposition are led by some very wealthy women, some Catholic clergymen, surprise, surprise, distilleries and breweries, urban political machines, and some Southern congressmen, as well as corporate capitalists. So what would they have in common? I think there would be seeing that suffragists did have some sort of affinity with the abolitionist movements. So you would see some of that coming out of these Southern congressmen. I think the corporate capitalists, this is this idea of this pure woman. So I think you're seeing these different strands come together. In the meantime, the states are adopting women's suffrage. So California now adopts it. Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, I always say that my two favorite presidents are the two greatest Republicans of all time, which are Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt actually supports women's suffrage, and it's the first time a major political party, and that's Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party, supports it. You've got these parades with thousands of people. You have more states adopting. You have, so we have now Oregon, Kansas, Arizona, Nevada, Montana. They're all adopting. You have also a grassroots petition with this transcontinental tour by Mabel Vernon and Sarah Bard Field they get 500,000 signatures on petitions to go to Congress. Now you have a 40,000 person march in New York City. You have, in the meantime, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts are rejecting women's suffrage again. Then you have the first woman elected to the House of Representatives. This is 1916. We're getting close, right? You have New York finally gives in. It gives women their suffrage. Arkansas women are allowed to vote in primaries. we have this picketing in front of the White House. Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? How long must women wait? So you have all this going on, a hunger strike, more states. Finally, President Woodrow Wilson says he supports it, and he addresses the Senate, and he asks them to adopt women's suffrage at the end of World War I. And then finally, in the 1919 to 1920, we see that it passes. It finally passes in Tennessee 100 years ago, 2 days ago. And on August 26th, which is in 6 days, it's actually certified. So we are right in the middle of that exactly 100-year period. This is what the 19th Amendment says. It says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Anyway, that is my presentation. I think I did miss a slide, which was from the 1890s, but it's more of the same. So I am going to end with that and see if any of you have questions. Before I take questions, though, I want to thank the People's University. Sean is amazing. He works so hard. He has so much energy. He's not only brilliant, but just incredibly learned. And I think really just wants to authentically understand all these different areas and have open conversations. And that's what's wonderful about democracy, is that we can disagree, we can agree, but we should all be able to talk about things in a pleasant manner and learn from each other. So with that, I would like to open it up for questions.
Can you see the question on your screen?
No, I cannot. Do you want me to get out of this? Maybe if I get out of it, I'll be able to see it.
If you close your PowerPoint, you should see it.
Okay, let me see. I can now, yes.
And then I can go wait.
Okay. Barb, hi, how are you? It's good to see your picture. So the question is, it seems to me that these virtues assigned to women with such moral obligations, values, submission to their men, etc., that were required of women at this time originated because of religion and were driven by religion. Which religions were the driving force behind this? So yes, that's a really good observation, and it would have been Christian religions, and it was predominantly Protestant. But of course, later on, interestingly, but particularly when it was, I'm Catholic, so it's going to be interesting what I say here. When it came out to be the Temperance movement, the Catholic clergymen got involved. So I'm not sure whether that was because, I don't know how many of you know this, but Catholics have to have wine in their as part of their communion, and so maybe they had religious reasons for being upset. Maybe they also harbored some of these morals, but it was more of the Protestant branch of Christianity. But certainly there were also Catholics. But you didn't see other religions, like you didn't see Jewish people being involved in this. It was predominantly Christian and people of Christian, so-called Christian values. Yeah, and a lot of it was actually, actually then somehow grounded and said, this is what the Bible says, so it must be true. And of course, my response to that is usually, oh, so did you read the original Aramaic, which is your translation? Because of course we know there's many different English versions of this and they're translated. So of course that makes a lot of people upset. I don't mean to make them upset. I mean to really probe people as to why they believe what they believe. And let's look at the language. Does it really say that? Are there contradictions? So yes, Barb, that's a really insightful observation. Yes, as usual. Okay, Sarah. This image draws up memory of the Wicked Witch from The Wizard of Oz. Do you know if the timing of that narrative and this movement line up? In monster theory, we learn that the monster always functions on the fringes of society. So the imagery of the witch riding the bike is tied to her obviously not being pure or a perfect woman. Hey, you know, it's really funny you should say that, because I had the same idea that this was like the Wicked Witch. And so let's see. This is 1895. When was The Wizard of Oz written? I think it was written right around the same time, actually. Can someone do a really quick Google search to see when The Wizard of Oz was written? Let's find out. And that would be so funny. We need to get that information. Sean, if someone gets that information, can we put them in the lottery also? Whoever comes up with that. Yes, I think it is that time. I can't look it up I'm afraid of crashing the computer, but I think it is because I believe it might have been a little bit later, but I believe he was referring to that time period, because wasn't he doing the Yellow Brick Road was also about the gold standard, which is right around that time of the progressive Gilded Age, the progressive era. So I wonder when he wrote. I bet he wrote it around then, you know, after 1895. So let's see if someone can get that. Any other questions? What's your favorite film about the suffragist movement? That's from Jen. Oh my goodness. I don't know. I don't know, but I'll tell you what I really like right now. Oh, it was written in 1900. That's perfect. That's perfect. It was 1900. I'll tell you what I really like right now, which reminds me of this, and it takes place in 1895 and 1896. It's called The Alienist. And preparing for this, I couldn't stop thinking about that, which is about a woman who is well educated, but she's orphaned at a young age. And her father, I think, attended Harvard with these other men. And so she sort of has these men that kind of look after her, but she's totally against all of this, and she has her own business. And clearly she's going to be a suffragist. So I'm looking forward to when the rest of the books are written, because I think that they're going to be dealing with this. So I'm sort of punting, and I'm going to say, even though it's not yet there, it's about the women's movement, and it's about that time period and going there. So it's not quite getting to that, but it is The Alienist. And I would also say I'm reading a book right now that's from 1926, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's a contemporary view of events. And I will find out the name and send it to you, because it's so brilliant in that it's right then how people felt right after suffrage about the women's right to vote. It was written by a woman. And I couldn't finish reading it before today, but I've read a good portion of it, and I'm really liking it a lot. So I'll send that to you. Other questions? This is from, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Margin Bearhurl. I apologize for butchering your last name, and maybe your first name as well. But would you speculate suffragists in rural areas face more challenges in convincing others of their cause than did those in urban areas? I don't know. And that's what I'm really interested in learning. I'm speculating that there was some more equality in rural areas out of necessity. So, and then because there was more equality, that might go hand in hand with, it would be difficult. Well, what do you need this for? Right? Because you have so much freedom here on the farm, but I can be completely off. I would just think that this is something I'm really kind of been interested in lately. Why do so many things happen in the urban environments first? And there seems to be pressures in the urban environments for change that aren't in rural areas. And is that just because we are biased in favor of looking at urban history? And so there really are these pressures in rural areas? Or is it that there really is, it is different because things happen at a faster pace in cities than they do in more rural areas? But I'm fascinated by it, because as a native New Yorker, but who's lived now in West Virginia for 14 years, and then I lived in Virginia for 11 years before that. And I've lived in the South for most of my adult life. I haven't lived in the North since the 1980s, early 1980s. I'm very interested in this because I have sort of a foot in both the North and the South, and in rural and urban areas. Other questions? Okay, so Jean Heindel Feinstein. Another, I'm sure I butchered that one as well, because is it Feinstein, or is it Feinstein, or is it Finstein? I'm not sure. But I'm guessing Feinstein. What is the difference between a suffragette and a suffragist? And this is from Judy Hendrickson. Oh, and I know the answer to this, but I have to tell you that Sean actually gave me the answer to this. And a suffragette is the American version. Oh, sorry, a suffragette is the British version of a suffragist. It's just like saying lift an elevator. It's just one's a British term and one's an American term. So yes, that's it. The suffragette was used in England after a reporter, I believe it was, mocked the term. Women there embraced it, and women working for the vote here in the United States, however, rejected it and adopted the term suffragist. Perfect. Other questions? Carolyn, either Soka or Socha Ziegler. If disagreements over voter strategies were a problem, did men instigate these disagreements to prolong the issue of women's rights? Oh, so were there like instigators? I don't know. I would imagine that it would, was it really the men behind the scenes? I'm reading right now the last book that Martin Luther King ever wrote. And again, I can't remember the name of it right now, but I'm in the middle of it. And it was written in 1967, the year before he died. And he was saying that there was an internal debate on whether you should go more the Black Panther route of more black military, like black power, or this idea with white allies, bring white people into it and keep it very peaceful and not have violence. And he very much wanted, as we know, the peaceful route that was integrated with white people. And it was all done by, this whole thing was men of color making this fight. It was all kept inside, but the instigators were the media there because they were really interested in knowing what was going on. So they were like pushing it, which I guess probably would have been mostly white men. But internally it wasn't. So here we would have had, and what we'd have to research is whether or not the men inside these movements were putting a wedge between, say, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and, say, Stone on the other hand. And was that what was going on? And my guess is that the women probably, any woman that was doing this was probably pretty independent, and they probably were there was a lot of friction, and somehow they didn't get it together for whatever reason. Now, it looks like Frederick Douglass might have been some sort of also instigator, but he felt betrayed because here's this one group that's saying, no, we're not going to go for yours until we get everything. And, they're coming out of slavery. So in that case, I wouldn't call a black man an instigator. I wouldn't want to use it. I would say that he might have been a force that drove a wedge, and that I don't know for sure. But I would think he did actually, when he instead of trying to bring it together, he said, I withdraw my support from you. So that would lend support to at least that there were some men working against one side versus the other. Okay, Linda Commons. In the pre-Civil War era, was there universal agreement in the suffrage movement that the right to vote should be extended to black women as well as white women? Well, interestingly, black women were mostly left out of the conversation. So, and that's one of the things that I found also really fascinating, that it wasn't expressed. I haven't really found a lot of express stuff like black women shouldn't have the right to vote. It was more that there was a focus in terms of race, and that was, let's get rid of slavery, and then we give black people the right to vote. And then when they spoke about women, it was almost like women were really white. So you would say women, and then you'd say black people. So if you're a black woman, who are you? Are you a woman or are you a black person? Well, you're both. So they didn't really have a consciousness of, at least what I'm finding, is there wasn't really a consciousness of intersectionality. And I always find that's why I've been saying for years that the Democratic Party was going to become the party of black women, because black women have a unique perspective of understanding race and gender. So a lot of white women, I'm a white woman, I'm going to look at things from a feminist point of view. I'm not going to necessarily initially think about what it's like to have the problem of race in my life. A black man is going to think, oh man, I'm being discriminated against because I'm black, and he's not going to necessarily have the problem of gender on his mind. And you have women of color are going to be thinking what's called intersectionality. And I like to say that now that it's what I try to tell my students is, look, try to think of it this way. You're from Appalachia. If you go to New York, people will think certain things about you which are not very nice. So that's an intersectionality of, say, gender and Appalachia. Or even if you're a white male, you can experience discrimination by going to New York. As I would imagine, someone with a very, very thick New York accent might feel coming into Appalachia. That I know when I first came here, people heard my accent and some people found it very annoying. I haven't gotten that lately. I don't know if that's because they just know me better or whether they think my accent is less. But my point here is that I think that we tend to think in terms of who we are, that interests. And so there was a sense of compartmentalization. And although there were some black women involved in the suffrage movement, it was predominantly white women. And so I don't think they were intentionally excluded. I think it was more subconscious exclusion. Other questions? Mary Ann Duffy. I think more women were put in mental institutions back than that timid, and it is no wonder if women had to suppress all their emotions and live by those virtues. That mental cruelty, and also to know that you were only to use your body for procreation. I wonder how many women had postpartum psychosis. What do you think? Okay, so I took out a story about this, but that was exactly what they were doing to women. They were putting women into mental institutions at this time. A lot of other people too, but they were doing this. They were also, you might know of the really famous case of sterilization of Carrie Buck, who was a Catholic. 3 generations of imbeciles were enough, where she was sterilized. She's the mother because her mother was an imbecile, which meant she had an IQ lower than 70. She was an imbecile, and her infant, who was tested at the age of 1 month, was tested as an imbecile. Why did this girl, Carrie Buck, give birth to an infant? Because she was raped by her uncle. So she was the victim of incest. This child, the sad thing about this child is, first of all, Carrie Buck was then sterilized so she could never have children. Later on, she found out her sister was sterilized. So the whole family line is over. The child, well, you say, well, what about the child? Well, the child actually did very well in school up until 3rd grade, and then she died of the measles, which is tragic. So we also see that so why were these people sterilized? Mostly blacks and Catholics were sterilized because they were undesirables. This is a little later on. This is now the 1920s. So what we're seeing is unfortunately our country, and I think almost every country, has a history of us versus other. And if you happen to fall into the other category at some point in history, terrible things happen to you. From being disenfranchised to being sterilized to being enslaved to many other things. So I think, yes, that there was a lot of and by the way, let me add, I don't know if you guys have watched this on TV or read the books about the alienists, but they deal with that issue as well. So these are all issues that the person who researched those books did a really amazing job of that era. And he uses the Gilded Era as a backdrop, this excessive wealth, to what's going on to these women, these young boys. Also, there's some stuff about young boy prostitutes in it. and really just some really interesting things of the haves versus the have-nots and the polarization of society. Okay, margin again. What are your thoughts regarding the effect World War I and women going to work during those years had on the final push for the vote? Yeah, that, and also World War II for other things with the civil rights movement, I think are really important in understanding that here women, yeah, you know, you had to fight the war on two fronts. There was the war front, the literal war front where people are being shot at or whatever over in Europe. And then you have the manufacturing front, which was many women involved in that because, of course, they had to go to work because it was men that were in combat positions. So mostly men in combat positions. And women were not even allowed in combat positions, although sometimes they did see combat. So I'm not going to get into all of that. But just for the sake of simplicity, yes, women were working in manufacturing factories for the war. So you can imagine here they are doing all of this work. And by the way, women were also increasingly working outside of home anyway. So they're working outside home. They're bringing in money at a rate lower than men. So they're getting for the same job making less, and they can't vote. So yes, I think that had an enormous effect. And they were like, you got to do something about this or we're going to riot. And I always tell my students this too, because I teach labor law. That's my real field. I say, why did Republicans actually favor, let me put it this way. Why did conservatives finally favor unions? The Democrat or more liberal people it's not really Democrat Republican because remember we have with Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt and Taft sort of split the Republican Party, one toward a more progressive, which becomes sort of the progressive Democrats. And then you have the conservative Republicans become the Republicans of more modern year, pre-Trump though. Trump now has changed the Republican Party again. So I think what you have here is why did they do this? Why did they finally say, look, we have to support unions, we have to support women? Why? Because they realized it wasn't good for business. Why right now are businesses at the forefront of diversity? Because it's not good for business to discriminate against your best people. And some of your best people are going to be women and people of color. In other words, some of your best people are going to be white men also. But if you only give promotions to white men, you're going to miss some of your best people. So, and you're going to make society unhappy because you're going to make all these women unhappy. You're going to make all these people of color unhappy. And so what happened? They're going to make all these union working class people unhappy. That was back with the union movement. So what happens? They protest. And when they protest, they have disruptions of commerce. And that's why we have the National Labor Relations Act. And guess what? I've been telling my students for years, for 20 years, 14 here and 6 in Washington, D.C., that we will see increasingly more and more riots as workers' rights get suppressed. That this is actually better for business to actually give some rights. And it's happening. I mean, the empirical evidence is out there. Other questions? Could women get bank loans for purchase of their own property? Generally, no. I mean, it depends what year you're talking about, but if you're talking about the 19th century, no. It would be the only women that could do business in their own name were widows because they would inherit their husband's property. So there was the whole rich widow phenomena was these men wanted to marry these rich widows because then they would get their money from the first husband or the second husband or whoever. So generally, no. So a lot of these women didn't want to, if you were a rich widow, why marry again? I mean, you fall in love, you might want to marry, and the man is very good to you. You just accept that there's this unfair structural sexism. But you might also, and remember, there's enormous pressure to do that because if you want companionship, it would be naughty to seek companionship with a man and not be married. So I think there would be enormous social pressure on women to do that. Sarah, the other thing we can say in business is that diverse teams innovate better because of the exchange of a broader range of ideas. Absolutely. This is the idea of the team of rivals that Lincoln had. And I think I always like to have people disagree with me. Like in my classes, I actually promote disagreements. When my students get upset, I don't like what he said, I don't like what she said, and I say, well, you're not going to be a very good lawyer if you don't like what people say, because people say things you won't like all the time. But actually listen to what they have to say, because you might have to respond to that in court, and you get better at your own arguments. But also in business, where things are less adversarial often, and in business you want to cooperate a lot of times. I mean, sometimes you're competing also, but a lot of times you're actually trying to, you have these, like you said, these teams. You're going to learn more if you have all different types of people on your team. Some who are risk averse, some who are more risk loving, some who just have different backgrounds, speak different languages. Even if you have people that have different first languages, but they all speak a common language so they can communicate with each other, you have different points of view on things because they thought of things differently when they grew up. They learned a different language. So another reason why I'm a big lover of people learning a second language is it makes you think differently. Other comments or questions?
I think we've reached the end of questions.
That's wow,
pretty good number there. And
it was great. Good job. Smart audience. Smart.
Yeah. Well. And I have here in my hand the winner. I have selected from all the names that asked questions just to prove it.
Okay.
Mix it up in my hand and pull it out. So here's the winner. I'm going to reveal it now, live, and later taped.
So exciting.
If I can get a drum roll, that'd be awesome.
All right.
Linda Cummins is the winner.
Who is it?
Linda Cummins.
Okay, yay! The winning question from Linda. Awesome. Congratulations, Linda.
Yeah, yay, Linda. And so, Linda, I will send you that via the U.S. mail while it's still functioning and to support the mail. So look for your Votes for Women puzzle. And I just wanted to do my own screen share quickly here to show you next week's program again. With Joyce Salisbury is very impressive because she does these great courses on this subject about the powerful women of history. So that's going to be a really good program. Please join us next week. Now, Anne-Marie will be back. I believe it's week 5. I forget what date that is. September 20, maybe, something like that.
Something like, it's around 2021, like that, yeah.
Yeah, and you'll be talking about the Equal Rights Amendment at that time.
Yes, and I will say there is a really great courses that on the Gilded Age that goes through some of the stuff I went today, and in fact, it's in my bibliography. And there's one of the episodes exclusively on women, so it's really wonderful. I highly recommend it. So I'm very excited to hear it from this woman next week. I
am too. And so take a look later, Anne-Marie, at all the thank yous and wonderful comments you're getting from our viewers. And thank you, everyone who attended, and we will see you next week.